For joining us for the introduction to the IES Revit 2011 plugin. Today we're going to cover some tips and tricks as well as some general information about this plugin. But again, as I'll mention many times during this presentation, you'll want to refer to the white papers that are listed at the end of this presentation. They're going to give you more detailed information on successfully importing your model from Revit into IES. So just to talk a little bit about our new Revit plugin that will help you bring geometry out of Revit through a GBXML format. This is similar in a way if you go to the drop-down menu here and go Export, File, GBXML. However, there are a few benefits to using our toolbar. If you go under the Add-ins tab, after you've installed it from our website, what you can do is preview your model much in the same way that you can when you actually go File and Export. But the benefit here is that we've actually added some new features that help heal your model. And anyone who has tried to work with GBXML files before knows that often they're not problem-free. They'll have errors, they have problems with them, holes on the exterior of the building, which can really damage your export quality. And that sort of thing causes a lot of issues to creating your Revit model, bringing it in for analysis, and making it usable. So the key here is to create quality geometry that we want to bring in, but we also want to make sure that we are setting it to the right amount of detail. When you run a model, we have under our Settings and Info button here, and going under the Settings tab, you are able to choose the detail of your export. Now as an architect, things like mullions, walls, wall layers, if you have walls layered next to each other, and these type of details are extremely important for your construction drawings. However, that's actually not true when you're doing an analysis model. And things like the most complex type of analysis, which would be mullions and shading surfaces, are actually going to turn each small mullion that you have into a full rectangular three-dimensional object. And this may be fine, again, if you're doing construction drawings, but when we're bringing this in for analysis, that type of detail is just too much, especially if you're doing this at the early stages where you want to get a quick, easy feedback. So if we actually think about energy analysis or any type of building analysis, we're looking at what's happening with the daylight spilling into the spaces or solar radiation and how that's being blocked or changed by, just to keep on this example, those particular mullions. So having something very detailed, let's say it's a 1 centimeter or 1 inch mullion, is that really going to matter in the scheme of your project? And often you'll find that because it's early stage, you're just looking for early numbers. You don't need that. So please try to keep it as simple as possible. That's really one of the first steps that we have. If you need to add very detailed things, that's fine as well, but you may just be doing one type of room for analysis. This will come over, and whether it's in our program or other programs with many shading surfaces, the higher up the list you go. So again, always the first step is saying, what's important to this project? How much detail do I need? So for this case, I'm just going to choose simple and hit OK. And this is the type of model that we're actually going to bring in. At the top here, you'll see different guidance that will tell you how to work on this model. We actually have two guides. We have the Revit white paper and we have advanced tips for translating into Revit. And both of those are great, especially if you're working with things like network locations and other type of details that you need to get very specific for. We have a lot of tips in there, but the reality is the model cannot be as complex as a full construction drawing set. And most of the people out there who have actually started successfully translating them know that. And many companies will have a separate model that's used for analysis. And not that it is completely separate, it's something that you may have saved off after design development and the form of the building was decided upon before you started adding a lot of detail. So then to bring our geometry in, we're just going to go into the Import Model button and hit this. And it's going to start running and finding all of the rooms and spaces inside of my project. So for Revit MEP, these are going to be spaces. For Revit architecture, we're going to be bringing in our rooms. And it's important to have things like our room and area settings turned on. We also want to make sure that we have the rooms set, again, to find volume, but also set to fill the entire room. And these are the types of tips that you will find in the Revit handouts. And going about this without using them, it's not really a good idea, because nothing is going to translate perfectly the first time. And I think that's one of the biggest misconceptions that people have with this. So when we get this box up, we can think about where is the destination of this file. If we're bringing it into VEware or the toolkits, or even into Gaia, we may want to assign some of our constructions here just to get started. And again, because we're looking at early stage, we're using templates for things like our office, which are assuming a certain type of occupancy. We don't need to be 100% correct that, oh, we have, for example, in this point, we have 1 inch gypsum instead of 0.75 inches of gypsum. Because again, we're just trying to figure out how can we compare option A to option B, which is really the benefit and the direction that you should be going with early stage analysis. Again, you're never going to be replacing the engineer and figuring out the layout of your HVAC system. You're just looking to say, option A that I have designed compares to option B in this way. So when you think of it in that aspect, assigning your constructions with a drop-down list like this is a very reasonable thing to do. And you may ask, what about the constructions that I have already set up in Revit using my properties of my wall? Well, the things that are contained in there are things like your R value or your U value. But even though the core of your wall may be defined, it doesn't contain enough information for analysis. So that's why you have a separate dialog box here where you need to set your room constructions. And that's just part of this GBXML. That's not coming out as usable data for an energy analysis. And that's with our tool or with other tools. You're always going to be applying the constructions after until the constructions become detailed enough that are coming out of Revit to give us that information. The next thing that we're going to set are some typical systems. And again, if we're not an engineer, we're not making our own types, we're going to set it at this level. Also from my drop-down menu, I can pick the type of building I have. Again, if I pick office, there'll be a certain number of people per square foot or per square meter. It's also going to assume things like hours of occupancy. Is this open from 8 to 6 p.m. or is this only open, is it open all during the day, or do they take time off for lunch hours in some of the rooms? And if we just had a simple building form at this point, we wouldn't have to worry about setting the individual rooms. But since we do have some rooms, we can actually go further and say, okay, these are particularly corridor spaces. And everything is going to assume it's the building type, which would be under office, unless otherwise stated. But the most important thing, if you're looking for comparison models with a tool like Gaia, is that you keep this to be, you have a baseline model and you keep it fairly standard. So you're changing one thing only at a time. You're not going to say, my first baseline, I had this many square feet or square meters, then I changed my glazing and my wall construction, and I changed the building form, because that's not going to give you an idea of what may have been the ramifications of that one change. So the thing to think about, create a baseline and change one thing, whether you're changing form and seeing the effect or changing shading and seeing the effect. That's the way to start to understand where and what makes the biggest effect or has the biggest effect on my model. The next thing that we're going to do is check our model. And this is extremely important to make sure that the model is translating correctly. So when I run through check model, you're going to see a list of every space that we have, and the room names are actually going to come through if you're using this with Gaia or in the VE. It's going to tell me the area of each of my rooms, my internal walls and external walls, and the volume of those spaces. But most importantly, on this right-hand side, you're going to see something called missing surface area. Because Revit translates from the center line of a wall, if you have exterior walls where the center line does not perfectly align with each other, previously in the GBXML, we would deal with gap issues, meaning that where that center line didn't align, there would actually be a small hole where those lines had to fill in, and that exterior wall would become It wouldn't be completely straight line. So here in our new healing tools, the missing surface area is filled in depending on its size. So if it's a small hole, it's going to be filled in just as an opaque panel, which will translate through based on its position as a wall or a roof or another type of object. If it is above a certain size, this is something that you could have intended, so that is going to translate through as a glazing item. So once we have checked this and it looks good and we're pretty happy with what everything looks like, we're going to close this out. We're going to say that I have checked the model and it's ready for analysis. If we want to just pull up another one as an example, let me go back to my settings and info. Go back to my settings and let's change it to simple with shading surfaces. And I'm going to hit OK. And I'm going to pull up to import my model again. And you can see at the bottom here it's actually running through each of the different spaces. And again, those rooms have to be placed or nothing is going to come through. That's really the key part of the GBXML and the translation of it into any type of analysis software. Okay, and now we have our model up and you can see that actually the parapet is the shading surface that's showing. If we added the mullions, those would come through as well. So looking at this, I may start to think, all right, if I do the daylighting in one of these spaces, this may actually be a factor, so I may want to leave this. But if it's only on the top, I may decide that for an early stage analysis, I don't really need to have this happen. So I'm just going to check it again. I know that this model is okay, so I'm just running through it. I'm going to say that I have actually checked this for analysis and say okay. The next step is to then bring this out to the full virtual environment, to the toolkits, or to VEware. So let's go into the full virtual environment since we have been doing a lot of videos on Gaia, and this will bring our geometry from Revit into the program for us. And you can see the full VE opening here. The same thing is going to happen if you have the Gaia installed. You may only have the Modelit and Component Library applications, but under the navigators you'll see that your VE Gaia list is accessible. Okay, so just to look at this building, I'm going to actually go down to this drop-down menu to rotate it to an axonometric view, and then I'm going to pull out my preview. When this comes up, I'll see the exact GBXML that I translated in, and I'm going to see that my spaces are showing in blue, meaning they're a room, and things that are not connecting to a room, not an air-conditioned or occupiable space, is going to be showing in green. If I have any rooms, or something that's very common is you'll see a telltale line of green here between floors. You may have your base offset for your rooms not set high enough, and this is a very typical thing, or you may not have on your calculate room and volumes. So those are the types of things that you'll have to go back into Revit, check that, and make some changes. So just for an example, I always like to tie my rooms, and I'm just going to go to one of my sections here. And if I turn on my graphics, actually I can probably just grab one of my rooms. So if I grab this room, you're going to see that this room is actually tied to the floor above. When I go into my room properties here on the left-hand side, it says my upper level is the level above. That way, if I need to change the height of this upper level, this room is not going to be dropped below. So if I drop the height of this, what will happen is that my room is only going to be this high, and everything above it will become a shading surface. So that's really the key, is making sure that these are tied correctly. By default, the way that they start is it's going to be a room and it will be placed with a base offset. So you just want to make sure that these are set up and either set up to a level above or a limit offset that brings you above your roof or floor above. Because the important thing is that this floor becomes the entity that is stopping this room from expanding above. And that is what tells Revit that we have a room and that's what's being bound in this location. And there's many other tips and tricks that you can look at, and those are the types of things that you're going to want to go to the advanced Revit tips for. So now we're going to take this model and we're actually going to bring it into VE Gaia in one of our next videos.